It's 6 o'clock tonight, right, Keith?
Yes,
Yes.
the virtual happy hour.
Right.
All right.
Right.
All right. Hello, everyone. It looks like we have about 38 participants. It is about 11 o'clock, so I'm going to start things off in about another minute or so. Just give some more people a chance to join. All right. So it is about 11:02, so I'm going to kick things off. Hopefully everyone can see me. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kara Ward, and I'm a Senior Account Executive with Contemporary Staffing Solutions. I'm so excited to be kicking off this webinar, and I think we've got some really great topics to discuss. This program is going to last about an hour. It will be 45 minutes for the presentation, and then at the end, there will be a Q&A during the last 15 minutes. So if I could just ask everyone to please hold your questions until after the presentation. Our technical moderator has muted everyone, so you can use the chat feature at the end to submit your questions. And if you are new to Zoom or you don't know where the chat feature is, you can just hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen and click chat. And we will review all questions at the end. So now I would like to introduce Evan Violette, Managing Director of CSS Professional Staffing Group, and our subject matter expert and my good friend Keith Black, who's the Principal of Employment Practice Outsourcing. Together, Keith and Evan will break down the basics and bring some clarity to the uncertainty surrounding COVID-19 and the new federal laws. This webinar will be in two parts. First, gaining an understanding around the $2 trillion coronavirus relief bill, and second, to gain an understanding on how HR needs to advise their employers and business partners on how to shift and recruit talent after the coronavirus ends. So with that said, let's learn a little bit about Evan Violette and Keith Black.
Awesome. Thank you, Kara. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I know that everyone's time is very limited, and I hope that you guys find a significant amount of value, and a special thanks to Keith. My name is Evan Violette. I've been on the front line with our employees and customers for almost 9 years with Contemporary Staffing Solutions. Since 1994, we have been nationally offering professional staffing, both technical and non-technical, along with managed services to our customers. The coronavirus has certainly humbled our community, our nation, and our world. CSS is adjusting to the new normal by successfully embracing work from home, and we're utilizing our advanced technology to stay connected. Last week, our company started a series of webinars in the health and wellness and Salesforce space. This week and ongoing, we're going to start a series of webinars to our targeted audience that will include human resources professionals and talent acquisition leaders across the country. And we will be partnering with the C-suite and leading business partners to help them adjust to our new normal. I would like to take a moment to introduce Keith Black of Principal Employment Practicing Outsourcing. Keith has a unique background as a labor and employment attorney with leading national law firms and as a top human resources executive in various industries. Keith views client situations and solutions with a different and more holistic perspective. Keith's passion is building and maintaining a respectful workplace platform through practical leadership, education, clear and consistent communication, in creating a workplace built on the guiding principles of respect, trust, honesty, and empathy. Our values at Contemporary Staffing Solutions align perfectly with Keith's, and we're very appreciative of Keith joining us today. So with that being said, I'd like to take a minute to bring some clarity to these unprecedented times. Keith, the government recently passed a $2 trillion coronavirus relief bill. Businesses are essentially being forced to close, and millions of people are out of work due to an effort to fight the spread of coronavirus. Keith, could you tell us what are the new laws that recently passed to try to help everyone get through this crisis?
Sure. And good morning, everyone. Thank you, Evan, for the introduction, and Kara and Sharon for having me join you today. I know this is a lot of information, so much probably that it makes our heads swim a little bit. So what we're hoping to do today in just a really short period of time is to give you a practical overview of what HR leaders really need to understand about the basics of these laws. So we're going to talk primarily about two recent federal laws, the FFCRA, which is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and the CARES Act, which is the stimulus bill or the recovery bill that was just passed. And the FFCRA, we're going to break down into two separate pieces because they really do address different issues, but they're designed to work together.
Yeah, so Keith, if you don't mind, can we dig a little bit deeper into the FFCRA?
Yeah, the FFCRA is broken down into two pieces. And the first piece is called the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. And that provides 2 weeks of paid sick time to employees for one of 6 reasons. And it's really 5 reasons because the 6th reason is kind of a catch-all that won't really be something that HR folks need to concern themselves with. But the first 3 reasons have to do with the employee's individual health condition, whether they've been ordered to isolate or quarantine, or whether they're being actively seeking medical diagnosis. Those are conditions 1 through 3. And then conditions 4 and 5 are when the employee needs time off to care for an individual or their child. So that's really the basis of the Employee Paid Sick Leave Act, and it provides 2 weeks of pay for one of those conditions. There are a couple of important pieces to it. And the first is that employers who are in the business of employing healthcare providers or emergency responders may find that there is an exemption for those individuals if they feel that it would be a hardship to the business. And small businesses, which are defined as those under 50, may be exempted if employees requesting this leave would jeopardize the viability of the business. And I should say that this law applies to all private employers with less than 500 employees and most government employers as well. And there's no obligation or requirement that the employee work there for a certain number of days. They're eligible for this leave the day they're hired. And the amount of the leave for the 10 days depends on whether the employee is using the leave for their own personal reason, which is 1 through 3, in which case they get a certain amount, up to $511 a day at the maximum, or whether they're using it for reasons 4 or 5, which is to care for another individual, at which point it would be a lower total of up to $200 per day for that.
Thanks, Keith. And Keith, I know you mentioned that there was another law called the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act. Would you mind explaining that in more detail for us, please?
Sure, Evan. And the emergency FMLA is a supplement to the existing, or what we're now calling the classic FMLA. And it's different in a number of ways from the classic FMLA. The first being the only requirement is that the employee has to have worked for the employer for 30 calendar days, and they're eligible. Again, this applies to employers of 500 or less, and it provides for employees to take up to 12 weeks of paid Emergency Family Medical Leave Act. But the very important thing that a lot of HR folks and employers don't understand is that this is really limited to only reason number 5 that we just talked about, which is to care for a minor child of the employee whose school or place of care is closed due to the coronavirus pandemic. So if you fall under that situation and your child's school or childcare is closed, you're eligible to take this leave. if you've been working for your employer for 30 days or more and they have less than 500 employees. The first 2 weeks of the 12 weeks rather are unpaid. However, as I mentioned earlier, the two laws were written to work together. So it's possible and likely in many cases that employees would use the Employee Paid Sick Leave Act to pay them for the first 2 weeks, and then the FMLA to be paid for the remaining 10 weeks. And it's important to understand, those of you who are familiar with FMLA and intermittent leave under this is only permissible if the employee can telework and for the care of a child. So for the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, if you're using those 2 weeks to take care of your own personal illness, that cannot be used intermittently. It can be if you're using the EFMLA for purposes of childcare, which is its only purpose. And for example, your spouse can take 2 days off and you can take 2 days off, and maybe you'll work with your employer to balance it out that way.
And Keith, just out of curiosity, I'm sure there was some light reading to get behind that. So how long were those laws? How long were they written?
Well, the CARES Act, which is the next one we'll talk about, was about 850 pages, I think. And for the FFCRA, the Department of Labor has already come out with 4 separate sets of guidance and temporary interim rules. So it's been volumes of pages already. And one of the problems with getting laws written and passed so quickly is that you really don't have the time to think about them and to talk through all the potential possibilities and outcomes that you normally would in a situation where you're drafting legislation. These had to be pushed through on an emergency basis, and as a result, it left us probably with more questions than it answered, which is why the Department of Labor has continued to come out with these questions, frequently answered questions.
And Keith, I know we have a lot of HR leaders joining us today. So with perspective to the CARES Act, I know you mentioned it was 800 pages. Could you just break down some of the main components that would be most relevant to our human resources professionals joining us today?
Sure. And, there's 6 or 7 relevant parts of the CARES Act that really do address HR people specifically. And there are many more than that in general in the law. But for our purposes today, and to try to stick within the time frame, I'm really just going to focus on the 2 main ones that people are talking most about, and that's the Paycheck Protection Program and the direct lending for U.S. businesses. And the Paycheck Protection Program, again, applies to that same group of employers that we just talked about, which is those with under 500 employees. And what this allows employers to do is to take a potentially forgivable loan, and if they use this money to pay employee salaries, health insurance premiums, rent, utilities, basically any operating expenses, the loan will be forgiven. There's a couple conditions. You have to maintain the workforce over a certain period of time. You can't use the money to pay for the emergency paid sick leave that we just talked about or the emergency FMLA, but it's designed to try to keep employers afloat and designed to try to keep employees on the payroll. And if they do this, they don't need to repay the loan. And then the second part is the direct lending piece, and that's for larger employers. Now, a big chunk of that was carved out for the airline industry, as most of you probably have read, but it also left an awful lot of money for businesses in that 500 to 10,000 employee space. And it's similar in the concept of trying to provide money on a forgivable basis to allow employers to keep working and keep in business and to keep employees working. And it doesn't, it has a little more conditions, a few more conditions that need to be met than the Paycheck Protection Program. But those are the 2 major bases of the CARES Act for HR purposes right now.
And Keith, just in terms of both of these new laws in the CARES Act, when did these go into effect?
They went into effect, the FFCRA went into effect April 1st. There was some discussion about whether it would be April 1st or 2nd, and that was clarified to be April 1st. The CARES Act just went into effect, and I know businesses were rushing to get their applications in, at 12:01 the other day when it went into effect. It's in effect now. There are a number of logistical issues, as you can imagine, with trying to get applications for the money and trying to get the Small Business Administration to to process applications. So that's kind of the mad rush right now, but they are both now in effect. And I should mention also that the FFCRA was drafted specifically for a period of time. So it sunsets or ends on December 31st, 2020. This is not a long-term extension of the Family Medical Leave Act, although depending on how things go, Congress always reserves the right, of course, to extend it beyond that. But at this time, it was written for a limited period of April 1st through December 31st.
Thank you. And Keith, just in regards to unemployment benefits, how do these new laws specifically impact the unemployment benefits?
Well, that's a great question, and it's something that's raised a lot of concern of late, because as you know, unemployment benefits are generally regulated and administered by each individual state, but the Department of Labor has overall oversight over it. So the first thing that the federal government did in this process was to open up the eligibility for employees and for states to allow employees to claim unemployment. And you'll see them listed there as A, B, and C. So while in the past, an employee couldn't quit their job voluntarily, there were certain very specific requirements that would entitle them to unemployment compensation. But now they've made clear that if states choose to do it, and most are, if the employer ceases operations, even temporarily because of the outbreak, or if the individual is quarantined but expects to return after the quarantine, so that's a temporary separation, or if they leave their employment because of a risk of exposure or infection, those things now can open up the gates to allow them to seek unemployment, where in the past issues like that would not have. In addition, the federal government has now added a $600 weekly supplement to unemployment claims, and this is what's getting a lot of concern and attention, because this is on top of the money that the states would already provide, and it's also extended the time frame of unemployment for 13 weeks. So theoretically, an employee can, with this additional $600 a week, can earn more money on unemployment than they are working. And the concern in a lot of camps right now is that this will create a disincentive for people to come back to work, or even an incentive for people to leave work and go out on unemployment so that they can bring home more money than they would have if they worked. And one of the problems is, and I mentioned the laws being rushed through so quickly, there are 10 bases for when an employee can claim self-certify for unemployment. And one of them is, quote, they had to quit, unquote. Unless you're a better mind reader than I am, that's pretty wide open in terms of what that means. So Evan, if you quit your job today and you applied for unemployment and your reason was you had to quit, theoretically, you self-certified, you're entitled to unemployment payments. And nobody's really sure what that means in terms of what can the employer do about that? How will the state's unemployment referees view that? Because it's part of the current law. So there is concern there, and I think there are some things that will need to be addressed. I think a lot of people believe that helping people and providing as much unemployment protection as we can right now is a great thing. On the other hand, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense if you provide them with more money on unemployment that they would get if they worked at their job. So that's kind of up in the air to be determined. The other big thing is that unemployment now can apply to those who are self-employed or independent contractors, which in the past were not entitled to unemployment. And finally, if you are able to telework, if teleworking is made available to you by your employer, even if you can't get to work, you're not eligible for unemployment. So it's only if teleworking is not a viable option.
Thank you, Keith. And would you mind just defining, to the best of your ability, telework?
Yeah, teleworking is when an employer makes the determination that the essential functions of your job can be done from a remote workplace, in this case, home. So, that's going to be dependent largely on the actual job the person does. If they're a maintenance worker at a school, it's kind of difficult for them to be a teleworker. If you're mostly handling telephone calls, looking at people's accounts, making sales, doing a lot of things that a lot of professionals do, there are ways that can be done remotely if they're given the appropriate equipment and systems to do it. So if that's possible, and if the employer says, yes, Evan, you can get your job done working from home, then we're going to allow you to do that. Then that's considered teleworking. Now, the one last piece there is, if all that's possible, but Evan has 5 kids under 4 at home running around him all day long, yeah, it may be that he can technically do the work from home, but teleworking is not possible because he's otherwise prevented from doing it because of that situation at home. So those are the factors that we need to look at to determine whether teleworking is a viable option or not.
Perfect. Keith, obviously there's a lot of organizations that are dealing with these economic challenges, and we're hearing stories about furloughs and layoffs. And, would you mind just differentiating between the both? What the difference between a furlough and a layoff?
Sure, and I get a lot of questions about that. And, in the past, in the private sector, meaning non-government, furloughs weren't something that were very commonly used. So there's a lot of questions right now about what we mean by that. What's the difference? What's the impact? Generally, in the simplest terms, a furlough is just a reduction of the individual's days worked or hours worked. It's not a separation from employment. It's not a termination. If you're a salaried exempt employee, I say, Evan, next week you're on furlough. You're not working next week. You're on the payroll, but you're not getting paid. Come back the next week. That's a furlough, or maybe reducing 2 days a week. A layoff is more permanent in the sense that it actually separates them from the payroll. You're terminated. It could be a temporary layoff with the intent that you're going to be brought back. But if you are brought back, you're rehired as an employee. You actually have that break in employment that you don't have with a furlough. So that's the difference between a layoff and a furlough. Very important to understand in number 3 here, if you do furlough employees, you've got to be very, very clear with them that they're not to perform any work while they're on furlough, because you're not paying them for it. And this can have implications that can be significant to the employer. There should be a written authorization required before they do any work if they're on furlough to protect you from that. Because if you have an exempt employee, and we're talking about a salaried employee now who's exempt from overtime, if they do any work during a work week, they're generally entitled to be paid for the entire work week. So if Evan answers 2 or 3 emails that I send him during a week he's on furlough, technically I need to pay him for the entire week now. So you've got to be really careful with that. And for non-exempt employees who are paid on an hourly basis, they need to be paid for all work they do. So if they work on a furlough, they need to be paid for those hours while they're on the furlough as well. So you need to be really careful. If you furlough people, make sure they're very, very clear that they don't do any work during that time period.
That's great, Keith. I just want to take a second before we move into the second part of our webinar and just remind everyone that the chat feature is available. We will certainly answer questions at the end. Just a reminder that everyone's is muted, so please utilize the chat feature to the group for any questions that you'd like Keith to answer at the end of our webinar.
Oh, Evan, one more point on the furloughs, if I may.
Please.
One of the changes in the unemployment laws that I just talked about, many states are permitting unemployment benefits for employees who are furloughed. And that's a big difference from the past as well, because typically, as I said, you had to have a separation from employment in order to be entitled to unemployment. And under these circumstances, in many cases, if you're furloughed, you can claim unemployment or partial unemployment if your hours are reduced as a result of that furlough. So that's a state issue. Make sure you check with your state or your employment attorney to find out how it applies to you. Thanks.
That's a good point, Keith, and I appreciate you adding that. Would you mind maybe just giving us a high level, what resources can people go to for, a lack of better ways of putting it, maybe the cliff notes to the laws and the CARES Act, just to get some notes on what that may mean for them in their state and their business. Is there any resources online that you would recommend?
Yeah, there's so many. I think part of the problem is finding the good ones. But the Department of Labor, as I mentioned, has issued 4 separate sets of guidance now on the FFCRA, and they include frequently answered questions, and they're up to over 60 now that really help give a lot of the answers that we're looking for. If you go to different states, if you go to pa.gov, the first thing that's going to pop up there is a coronavirus resource page. So pretty much every state has that, where they'll direct you to the specifics of their particular state. Law firms like Littler are all over this and have, as a former Littler attorney, I'll give them a plug, but they're really all over this in terms of, in my view, the best information out there, and they keep it completely updated. So those are a couple really good sources, but definitely the Department of Labor. Just go to dol.gov, and that's the first thing that will come up, and you can look at the frequently answered questions that are regularly updated and continue to be added to as we speak.
Awesome. Thank you, Keith. Well, Keith, thank you for walking us through the two new laws in the CARES Act. And, it's been very insightful. These are, again, obviously very unprecedented times. And I know that a lot of us are being impacted, whether it be through a family member, ourselves, or, someone that we know being potentially put on furlough or layoff. And I think all of us in the human resources and talent acquisition community are trying to bind together and just find the best practices. So, Keith, I know at the end we will distribute contact information, and I really appreciate all you've done, not only for contemporary staffing, but also our clients in helping navigate through this. So in the way of moving towards our second part of it, I'll turn it back over to you, Keith, and we'll talk a little bit more about what this may mean for the future of staffing and the impact on the war for talent.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that, Evan. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with y'all and to speak with everyone about this. I know it can be overwhelming, and we need to try to stay as positive as we can. Work together on this. We will get through it. But I want to flip the script a little bit now and put you on the spot. And from the seat of a talent acquisition professional, talk to us a little bit about what your views are on what this crisis means to the future of staffing and the war on talent that we're hearing so much, or the war for talent. How does this pandemic impact that?
Yeah, so Keith, it's interesting because prior to the coronavirus and the impacts that it's having on our economy, we really were in a war for talent. Companies were struggling to get people to engage with them, to get people to leave their job. And I think that there's a lot of strategies that companies can further implement to make themselves stand out and differentiate. I know right now, many companies aren't thinking about hiring. The thought is definitely more towards how can we take care of the employees that we have, keep them busy, and what does this mean for our business? But it's definitely going to be something that I think we need to start thinking about with optimism that we will be pulling out of this in the near future, that this is strictly temporary. And a lot of the new laws and acts that you've described, Keith, are going to hopefully get us there sooner than later.
Great. And I think we can all agree that when we do come out of this on the other side, it's going to be a very different world for us in a lot of ways, probably permanently. How should HR leaders and talent acquisition leaders prepare for some of the inevitable changes that we're going to probably see in recruiting and hiring practices?
Yeah, absolutely. Keith, one of the things that you mentioned earlier was the stimulus of obviously people receiving their unemployment, but also an additional $600 a month for 4 months. And I'll reference one of the points you made earlier about possibly disincentivizing people to go back to work. Oftentimes, we're talking about entry-level employees or lower paid employees that are, the bread and butter of driving our economy as a nation. I think coming off the war for talent that we've been in the last several years, we just need to start grasping the importance of perks and differentiators to attract and retain top talent. A lot of times I would say perks were slightly focused on over the last few years. We've seen a lot of businesses move to casual wear and, maybe having a ping pong table or a pool table, free lunches, things of that nature, which I think, have definitely driven to attracting certain generations and populations of people. But I think we all as business leads have to decide, what are we going to do to differentiate ourselves and make people want to join our teams? And perks are just a part of that.
So how would you suggest that we go about adjusting our business practices to meet this new normal that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to finding creative ways to offer bonus and incentive pay. We're going to have to really incentivize people to come back to work, especially those that are making the extra $600 a month. We have to find positions that maybe weren't previously offered additional incentive compensation, and find ways to drive opportunities to pay them for their performance. Offering them maybe some additional incentive pay. I firmly believe that HR has to be heard at the C level. And I think over the last few years, we've started to see a lot of the best leading companies have HR seated at the leadership table. And I think that working hand in hand, HR can help with forecasting headcount, offering creative ideas to modify what their company has to ultimately offer to their employees, and weighing in on how the advancement of technology can help identify a diverse pool of candidates. I think that the future of business is going to be, adopting some of the remote workforce out there, which is ultimately going to add to the competition, not only for companies, but for job seekers as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, I've been saying this to a lot of people lately, but HR forever has been complaining about not having a seat at the table. And I think this is an opportunity to be front and center, and for HR to really show our value to the organization and really lead and step up right during this pandemic and in the aftermath of it, because people are going to be looking to us and dependent on us to figure out where do we go from here and how do we deal with our people, which is our specialty. So when this does pass, what's going to happen when businesses try to ramp up their workforces to meet the inevitable demand surge that we're going to eventually see from this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I believe that job seekers have access to information more than ever, right? I mean, we all know about Glassdoor and the different reviews on Google, and I think companies are going to really have to put themselves out there and offer career pathing opportunities. We really need to sell the bigger picture. People are going to want to know what's in it for me to join your company. How stable is your company? Did you guys just recently go through mass layoffs? What does that mean? I think that, we're going to see companies offering enhanced benefits. I'm speaking specifically both healthcare and retirement. I think there's an opportunity for companies to spend a little bit more to differentiate themselves and entice top talent to leave their current company. We're talking a lot about, unfortunately, the people that are affected by furlough and being laid off, Keith. But, we can't overlook the people that are currently employed by companies that are just not adopting the new norm. And, I think that there's an opportunity for companies to find talent that are currently employed, but they're just dissatisfied with whether it be flexibility or, the different perks and benefits that their current organization is offering. Regardless of their generation, I think we're going to find a very diversified pool of talent out there who are extremely competent, very skilled with a high emotional intelligence. And this talent, truthfully, could be located anywhere throughout the country. So, like I said before, it's really going to increase the competition, not only on our employers and companies that are hiring, but also on the job seekers and how they'll differentiate themselves so that they can be considered for opportunities.
So interesting, because usually we hear of a buyer's market or a seller's market. You're saying there could be increased competition on both sides going forward.
Yeah, I think, with remote work, Keith, we've got a few of our clients that are really booming right now, happen to be in the financial, banking, mortgage industry. They have completely shifted to remote work. They had a team internally that got them ready to go, and they are sending laptops all over the country. So, historically, we were left to trying to fill these types of positions for these customers in a certain geographical area. And just in the last few weeks, they said, hey, wherever they are, we'll just ship them a laptop and we'll do webinar orientation and trainings. So it's definitely showing that there could be a trend where, that's going to increase the competition to a job seeker. When you can now reach into any different market in the country, I think that there's going to be a level of ownership too, as a job seeker and a candidate, to really differentiate yourself and make sure that you have a little bit of extra oomph or some of the key factors that the company is looking for to differentiate yourself against all of the applicants.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that in mind, how should HR professionals and HR leaders prepare to modify things like job descriptions and their benefit packages in order to attract and hire the right people for their jobs?
Yeah, exactly. I think that, job descriptions really should offer up, there's different things you can do from a technical perspective. I think having links in your job descriptions that will take, candidates to your social media or your Glassdoor page where you're openly speaking about what makes your company unique. It's just an opportunity for companies to attract better talent. From a job description perspective, I think there's going to be a lot of, cross training. I think there's going to be people taking on different roles and responsibilities. I think that entry level roles you're going to see becoming more combined, where people are going to be doing maybe one or two different functions that would historically have been two different jobs. But I think that, ultimately job descriptions are going to flex to the needs of what the companies are. And that may mean combining certain positions together and hiring a little bit more of an advanced employee than they maybe historically would have.
Great. Have you noticed any examples throughout this crisis of great leadership that you think are worthy of bringing to our attention?
Yeah, I think I'll reference our company just for a second, Keith, but I would say, within one day, I remember being in the office on Friday, geez, it feels like a while ago, but it was probably just about 3 or 4 weeks ago. Our leadership team had a conversation about, the need to potentially move to working remote. And we've taken a lot of necessary steps over the last few years to, engage with the right technology, the right tools, certainly have the right people in the right seats. But we moved within an hour of a leadership call to working completely remote the next day. I've seen a lot of business leads at our company step up and engage with their teams through, Zoom happy hours, different games, trivia nights online. One of the things that we take very seriously is our company culture. And I'm really proud of the leaders and my peers in how we're staying connected in a virtual isolation, essentially. In addition to our company, Keith, we do have a number of clients that are doing the same thing and, really staying very well connected with their employees. I'm sure we've all seen the pictures or the memes of people doing Zoom happy hours and Zoom meetups. And, one of the things that I think we're witnessing is just how hard employees are willing to work when they are remote and they are at home. We're seeing people, answer emails earlier than normal and clients answering emails later than normal as we all try to navigate through the blend of, work and home and both of those lives together.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we really need to focus on and not lose track of is when we have so many employees working from home now and changing their entire paradigm of how they work, we need to really focus on making sure they don't overwork. And, it's not as easy to just draw the line when you don't leave the office and drive home at night. And we need to be mindful, I think, of their mental and emotional status as well. And it's easy to just keep it turned on all the time, as you mentioned. Have you seen creativity in the hiring process as a result of some of the challenges? Obviously, we can't be having our normal interview processes and bringing folks in like we normally would. We'll talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. And Keith, the life we live is really cool because as recruiters and as partners to many of the people that are listening in today, we're offering up recommendations, but I would be remiss if I didn't say we're learning a lot through some of these magnificent companies and what they're doing. Just recently, we witnessed hiring managers meeting their candidates via Zoom or FaceTime for coffee, just to have more of a kind of a natural setting and a more relaxed feel, maybe not wearing the suit and tie, but, meeting up for coffee just to talk, get to know them. I think now more than ever, for those companies that are hiring, empathy is a part of the process. We've all talked, we've spent years talking about the candidate experience. And, I think now more than ever, the candidate experience is at the forefront of our minds because candidates are wondering, if I leave my job where I feel stable, how stable am I going to be coming to your job? I even heard a story the other week of someone meeting their candidate in a parking lot. Following the social distancing, practicing, they spoke to each other from their car just to be able to get out and talk to each other. Obviously these are things that companies are doing and we certainly wouldn't necessarily recommend, but that is just, to me, was an example that stood out of people wanting to bring that compassion and still have that personal connection. I will say that moving to virtual interviewing, I think, is going to help us even when we do get back into the offices. There are a lot of passive candidates that just don't want to leave during the business hours to go interview. And then there's a lot of hiring managers that unfortunately, may have obligations that they can't stay in the office until later that evening to meet with someone. So we're witnessing many of our clients even interviewing after dinner time and just doing more of a casual meetup. And I think that those are just some examples of how companies are being creative and really flexing to the candidates that they're considering.
Great. So I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball now and talk to us a little bit. What are some possible lasting effects that you see as a result of how we've had to change to get through this crisis? What do you think we might see for years to come?
Yeah, it's interesting, Keith. I've been reading a lot of people's opinions and I've tried building my own, but I'm going to keep this simple. And I really think that the silver lining is I think the digital infrastructure and remote working capabilities are going to have a lasting impact. I think that there's going to be a lot of companies that adopt operational processes that will now be streamlined through having better and more capable technology. I think that there's going to be an awareness that some jobs, or even perhaps the people in those jobs, are maybe not actually adding organizational value. And I think oftentimes the people that are in that seat, they know they're not adding organizational value. So possibly their work life isn't fulfilling what they need. And I think that not only are organizations going to identify who those individuals may be, but I think people are going to really take a step back and recognize I may not be happy in my job. And what do I need to do to find that sense of fulfillment? So, in the way of kind of summing it up from a silver lining perspective, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities across the country through digital transformation and remote working opportunities for not only companies to find and attract the right talent, but also for the job seekers to find that job that they're really going to get a sense of fulfillment out of.
Do you think we will finally get past the point of putting quotes or air quotes around work from home after this is over with? It's been a battle that a lot of us have fought to convince management in many cases that you really can work from home and you're not sitting on your couch eating bonbons watching Oprah all day. Do you think this is going to be kind of an impetus to say, well, yeah, we've seen it because we've had to see it and it does work, or it can work?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that while the bonbons are certainly more accessible at home in the pantry, I think people have been hungry for working from home, no pun intended. I really believe that people want to be able to work from home. It limits oftentimes just here in the Philadelphia market, 2 to maybe 2.5 hours of someone's day sitting behind the steering wheel, trying to get to and from their office. Whether that becomes the new norm Monday through Friday, or that's maybe just once every week or every other week, I think that there's going to be, I don't want to call it pressure, but I think that there's going to be more acceptance from companies in the way of, hey, we can do this. We have the right technology. We may just have to exercise it differently. And I think that there's going to be an appetite for the candidate or the job, the employees rather, to work from home. In my experience, Keith, and, I've been blessed to have a wonderful team. We're in a very metrics-driven company and industry, and people are producing at measures that we couldn't even have imagined prior. And I have to, just assume that that's happening elsewhere. And I really believe that, a lot of companies that maybe weren't as open to this previously are going to be open to it. And furthermore, I think they're going to have to be. Whether that means, hey, there's no more, rent or overhead, that could happen for smaller businesses where they have satellite offices. But I do believe, Keith, to answer your question, I do believe we're going to see more of the work from home. And I think companies are witnessing it, as I referenced earlier, they're being forced to witness it, that people are really going to get their job done while at home. And it may be those that aren't getting the job done that are they're not happy, they're not satisfied, or they're not adding organizational value, which in return is ultimately going to lead to that inevitable decision. It's the wrong person in the wrong seat, or the right person in the wrong seat, rather.
Yeah, and the reality is they probably weren't getting the job done at work either. We just didn't address it. Last question for you. What makes people want to work for your organization or your team? What's the draw?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think for our team specifically, Keith, I mean, I think we really work very hard to furnish a culture where we appreciate and recognize the hard work of the employees. I've worked at Contemporary Staffing now for just going on 9 years. And, I will say that our core values from the day I started till today are at the forefront of every employee, whether you're someone that's been here for 25 years or you're someone that has just started. I think that people want to know, what do the company that they're working for, what do they believe in, and how are they being held accountable to meet and match that culture. Beyond the core values, we are measuring performance at an all-time high. And, it's leading us to hire the right people who are willing to get into a competitive environment where we are servicing our customers. And we have two customers, obviously the employers that are hiring and the candidates that we're talking to about a future career opportunity. We drive peer-to-peer accountability, and we keep a tight culture, even now when we're working from afar. I give a lot of credit to the people internally that manage our social media. It keeps us all connected. And when I say all, us as employees, but also our clients and our candidates, on who we are and what we're doing. And I think that consistency is key, Keith, not only with our company, but with some of the great companies that we hire for. This is something that is ingrained in us, that you can feel and read on our Glassdoor. And it's something that we do consistently day in and day out, where I think people find a lot of comfort, considering not only joining our team, but the clients that we're trying to help them fill positions for as well.
Great, very informative. Thanks, Evan. Any other thoughts? Anything else you want to add? I know we want to leave a little time for questions.
Yeah, no, Keith, I think the only thing that I would add right now is, I know we've got a couple questions coming through the field, so we'll jump to those. And I appreciate everyone hanging out there. And if anyone's having trouble asking a question on this, please don't hesitate. At the end, we will provide our contact information, or you can certainly add both Keith and I on LinkedIn, and we will absolutely follow up with you individually to answer those questions. But Keith, I'm going to turn it back to you, because we do have a couple questions that I'd like to get through. And the first one is, how does a self-employed contract recruiter fit into the COVID relief funds? The person asking this question does both perm placement and provides themselves as a contract recruiter to their clients. They don't have any other employees, just themselves. So just to recap that question, how does this individual, being a self-employed contract recruiter, fit into the COVID relief funds?
It's a great question. And there's a couple different ways that they could potentially, and again, a lot of this is still to be developed. So the answers aren't very clear, but there are provisions for these small business loans to include independent contractors, small business owners, self-employed entrepreneurs. So there are potential ways that the individual could take advantage of that. And also the unemployment provisions that we talked about also are now applicable to independent contractors and self-employed. So there's potentially two ways that these laws could help someone out in a situation like that, where they have no other employees and they are in business for themselves.
Awesome. Thank you, Keith. Keith, another question that was sent to me is, have you specifically heard of temporary salary rollbacks, maybe 5 to 10% instead of furlough or layoffs? And the second part of the question is, would you advise on some important things to consider when doing this?
Yeah, absolutely. That's another great question. And yeah, that's becoming very common now. Let me just make the difference between a non-exempt employee who is paid on an hourly basis. Clearly, we can reduce their hours at any time. If you're working a 40-hour work week and you're paid for those 40 hours, you can be knocked down to 20. We could roll back the hourly rate. For a salary exempt employee, it becomes a little riskier because of what I mentioned earlier, that if a salaried employee works at all, they're supposed to get that same salary every week. But what we're seeing happen, and I think it's permissible, it's still kind of a gray area that a lot of employment lawyers aren't even completely comfortable with. But if you do this prospectively, so I say, Evan, you're a salaried employee starting April 13th, we're going to cut your salary 20%, and that will be in place for at least 3 months. You can probably do that without running the risk of having that employee converted to a non-exempt employee, where you now have to pay them overtime, which is the risk that you run if you mess with salaries of employees. So if you do it prospectively, so it's in advance, you're giving them notification of it, it's going to be more than for just a couple weeks. How long, we don't know for sure, but 3 or 4 months at least. And probably better that you not reduce their hours accordingly. And I know somebody who was just told, we're going to make you a 0.9. So we're taking a 10% pay cut and you're not to work every other Friday. You can probably do that. I think it's a little bit riskier because now you've got a one-to-one reduction of pay and time worked, which makes it more like a non-exempt employee. But I think under these circumstances, what I've gathered is that it's relatively safe to do a pay cut. If you do it in advance, or you tell them in advance, you communicate it clearly, and you make it longer than just a couple weeks or a few weeks. But it's a way to avoid terminating people. So it's a risk that a lot of organizations are willing to take, thinking that it's not a great risk right now.
Thank you, Keith. And Keith, I think it's only fair that since I was asked a crystal ball question, that I take an opportunity to just ask you a crystal ball question.
Sure.
Keith, you've obviously done a lot of research and you've been very in tune with what is being done by the federal government and what's being done at the state level. But here's the crystal ball question, and have fun with it, please. When do you think we will get back to some sense of normalcy? And what do you think may be some of the trajectory between now and then, just from your own opinion, Keith?
Wow, that's probably the most difficult question anybody could answer right now. And I'm certainly not in any place to answer that. But everything I've seen is it's going to be a long road. And it's going to be a long road before we get back to the normal of HR and hiring and talent acquisition and all of those things, a year or more. And I think, down the road, we're going to see some changes, some very real changes that, I hate the new normal. I always say I'm going to make a list of words I never want to hear again, like social distancing and new normal and virtual with anything following it. But when we get back to life after COVID, and then does that mean there's going to be another round in the fall that we need to get through too? I don't know. But once we're beyond this, I think there will be a lot of things that we do differently. And, as you mentioned earlier, Evan, I think that the digital capabilities of organizations are going to be significantly enhanced, and people are going to do a lot more remotely. We're going to realize we didn't need as many people in the positions we had them in, which may create opportunities in other roles. We may realize operationally we've been doing things inefficiently that we were kind of forced without much choice to change, but realized they were changes for the better. So I think there's an awful lot out there that will change and will probably change forever. But what it's really important to remember, and what I try to remind people, is don't lose sight of the day-to-day that we have to get done during this time period. We've still got to do performance management. We still have to investigate charges of harassment. We still have to make sure people are getting paid and that their benefits are being delivered properly. It's so easy. I've heard someone say, I'm working 25/8 lately, which is a new one for me on the 24/7. But I know HR folks and everyone are working so hard right now and are so involved in issues related to this pandemic that it can be easy sometimes to forget that we still have to do the basics of what we're here to do. And the key is that we've got to do it with compassion, we've got to do it with empathy, and we've got to do it with kindness, and really make sure that we keep our employees at the forefront, that we are sensitive to their needs and their concerns and their struggles. But at the same time, we've got a job that still has to get done. It's not going to go on break because of this.
Yeah, absolutely, Keith. And I know that's a loaded question, and I appreciate you, giving us some more of your insight into this. So with that being said, it does look like, we are almost up against the time, and I don't see any other questions being asked. Before I turn it back over to Kara, I just want to thank everyone for joining and send our well wishes to everyone and their families to stay healthy, and make the most of this opportunity and find the silver lining. We really do appreciate everyone joining us, and I'll turn the floor back over to Kara, but stay tuned because we will be doing another HR seminar in about a week or so, and we're open to topics and other subject matter experts joining us.
Awesome. Thanks, Evan. Thank you both, Evan and Keith, and thank you everyone so much for joining today. I'm definitely happy to have had the chance to introduce everyone to Keith and his advanced knowledge of the new federal laws. I also really value the insight Evan has shared with us about a changing landscape for hiring. So CSS will actually be launching HR webinars and will be showcasing various subject matter experts that are aimed at helping HR leaders navigate through these uncharted waters. So if you're passionate about human resources and would like to be included in our next series or become a guest speaker, you can reach out to our marketing department. It's just marketing@contemporarystaffing.com. Everyone on this webinar, however, will be sent a follow-up email that will include Evan, Keith, and our marketing department's contact information. Also included will be a recording as well as the slides shared today. So I want to thank everyone again so much for your time. We hope that you found value from this, and I hope that everyone stays safe and healthy, and don't forget to practice social distancing. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.